Penn State Extension, we are accessible to all stakeholders in Pennsylvania and beyond. So feel free to email us, or emailing us is the best way so we can track what the questions might be. And again, thank you to the commissioners for enabling us to be here today, and also our state representatives for the funding for Penn State Extension as well. So again, Tom Beresnyak, Joseph Conklin, we are senior extension educators with the energy team. Tom is actually also a rural broadband specialist. I think we might hear something from him later. It's possible. I don't know. We're going to ad-lib that one, right? Okay. There's several ways to connect with us. This thing's up top there, but we have a couple social media pages. We do have LinkedIn. We do have a host of webinars and fact sheets and articles on our website. A lot of the topics that we're going to go over today, there's further recorded webinars, like for instance, leasing. You can watch hours on leasing. First thing, if you are pushed for a lease, get a lawyer, right? You can also join us on Facebook, which has our up-to-date information on events and some articles we post on there as well. Some events that we do have coming up. If you want to drive all the way down to Lebanon, Pennsylvania next week, you can see a grazing sheep under utility scale solar presentation. That's going to be in conjunction with Cornell University. On October 28th, we have an applied energy efficiency for homes and businesses webinar. So if you own a home, which probably most of us do, or a business, this might be of interest to you. Some tricks for efficiency, and also some tricks for funding, grants and things of that nature. November 16th, agrivoltaics and large scale solar webinar we'll have. If you want to sign up for that, you should probably do that relatively quick. Came out earlier this week and we already have hundreds of registrants. We can only top off at 500. And then we aren't all about agrivoltaics or solar or energy efficiency as well. We also have natural gas in the Appalachian Basin coming up in December. We all think of natural gas for heating, but it also supplies like 60 to 70% of our electricity here in Pennsylvania. Something to remember. With that, I'll hand this over to Tom in the Energy Triangle.
Thank you, Joe. I hope you guys are all awake. If you remember one thing today, it would be this slide, because I had a conversation with, I'll give him credit because REA's here, Todd Saladay from Allegheny Electric. He's vice president for transmission and generation there. I asked him a question, and I didn't really expect an answer. I asked him a question. I said, what do you think the future of energy in Pennsylvania is? And I really did not expect an answer. And in a second, he said, I can tell you what it is right now. It lies in the energy triangle. And he said, as these things move, policy changes at the federal, state level, price of things change, and technology changes. As those three things move, that is where energy is headed. And I thought that was like the best answer I've ever received. And I told him I stole it. I was going to make t-shirts of it and everything. But an example of this is you had in Marcellus, we had a major technology change. You could do horizontal drilling. That was a major thing. And that plummeted the price of natural gas. So that was a game changer that really drove this state as a powerhouse in drilling and natural gas. So that's an example. Now you see a policy change in the Inflation Reduction Act. You see massive incentives coming in for all sorts of electric infrastructure. And we're going to talk about this, but this changes. I mean, administrations change, state policies change. This pushes all of this in different directions. But if you only remember one thing from this whole presentation, I think this is the slide to kind of stick in your mind as we go through some of this. So you can fall asleep now if you got that in your head. But just to reiterate what I said, Pennsylvania is an energy powerhouse right behind Texas. Massive gas fields here. That is still by far the biggest energy producing generation source in Pennsylvania is gas. Coal's still in there. Nuclear is a powerhouse. You don't hear that a lot, but nuclear is right up there. And if you look at hydroelectric and non-hydro renewables, it's not a lot in Pennsylvania, but it is definitely growing. But the powerhouse is still natural gas. And that's something we've worked with a lot when Marcellus kind of kicked off as well. But I just want to make sure you have that highlighted from a perspective of Pennsylvania. And when you look at generation sources, you see a massive jump from 2005. You see that coming into drilling, massive leap in natural gas electric generation up to 2020. It keeps climbing. That's right. It is. Nuclear stays very steady. Nuclear is obviously very expensive to get up and running, but it's very reliable and steady power for decades once it's built, which is the high upfront cost. And of course, coal, the policy changes on coal, you see that dropping in Pennsylvania, but gas has more than made up for that. And those bottom lines are solar. So it's not much, but it is jumping. You'll see it jumping here 17, 18, 19, 20. But when you go from like 1% to 2%, that is a massive increase. But it is just in perspective of where our electricity comes from. It's mostly nuclear and now gas generation in the Commonwealth. Give you perspective there. Just some terms that you might hear. Residential community solar, that's on your rooftop. You see some of that here. I know Indiana County in the borough had some success here with the solar. You don't see a ton of it out in the rural areas. Community solar is something a little larger. There's a lot of pending state legislation here in the state. We'll see where that goes. We don't really have a policy on community solar here yet, probably will at some point. And then we're mostly concerned with grid scale solar. This is what the farms get approached for. So they're larger arrays pushing up into that 25 megawatt, but over 5 megawatt scale. So we'll cover that a little bit more today. I just want to give you a snapshot of how your power gets to you, because this is really important to understand. Obviously, you have some sort of generation, whether it be gas generation or solar or whatever. And this is getting stepped up by a transformer so that it can go on these high voltage transmission lines. That's something to keep in the back of your mind. These big transmission lines, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Jack, I'm good. If you're into that 200 kilovolt to 400, you're probably in the $2 to $4 million or more dollars per mile. That has to be in there. So you have to have that in mind. So if you're trying to build solar arrays and get the power to the residents and the businesses, the amount and cost of infrastructure is enormous. I think they set aside $5 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act. That's not going to get you too far at $4 million a mile. So just keep that in mind as perspective. You have to step this up. You have to get the power to where it needs to be. You have to step it back down through a transformer, and then there's distribution to homes and businesses. But that component of the transmission lines is an important thing as you consider some of the things that are being proposed and just how expensive and probably hard to do in a short period of time for sure. I threw this slide in here because I think it ties in some of the things that are coming up later. You're going to talk about broadband a little later and EVs. So I wanted to throw a slide in on something called distributed energy resources. So this is a snapshot of what you'll likely see in the future, 10, 20, 30 years. Some of this is going on right now. For an example, you may have a solar array on your home that would be connected to some kind of demand response air conditioner. You have battery storage coming. You see a few folks have that. That's pretty expensive right now for battery storage. But if this is connected to a broadband high-speed network at your home, the electric company you go to can switch this on and off and send this resource somewhere else. So instead of 1,000 people being out of power, they might be able to quickly put this into 10 or 15 homes. And then these homes would backfeed farms and businesses that don't have it. So this is coming, but the back end of this requires broadband speed to do the switching. But this also requires a lot of investment in your home because your panels probably can't support this. You may be putting in some dollars to invest in upgrading your home, the amperage in the panel you have and some other things. I know there are some incentives coming for that, but I just wanted to have this in the back of your head as you think of what your home might look like in the future. This is a little bit of a snapshot of all of the growth in solar in Pennsylvania. And the big takeaway here is the jump from 2020 forward. And that's when some of this legislation really kicked in to go into grid scale. We see more requests for grid scale solar here in the state of Pennsylvania. So that just gives you a snapshot. Again, policy is kind of pushing that forward. And then from here, I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Conklin to talk a little bit about some of the stuff the DEP has worked with us on. He'll take it from here.
All right, thank you, Tom. We've done these presentations individually and with other people in the past, but never together. So we have a very high-tech switch over sheet here to know when to switch. So where does the Commonwealth stand on this? It depends on the agency, and most of it is guidance, not necessarily legislation at this point. So we have a lot of agencies working on this, whether it's DCNR, PDA. The one that we've been working most closely with is DEP. So a lot of the slides that we have actually we've worked on, or DEP steals our stuff, we steal their stuff. It's an amicable relationship, right? We all know we're doing it. So we work closely with DEP on these types of issues at the state level. So they did issue a Commonwealth of Pennsylvania grid scale solar siting policy in 2022. And again, it is guidance, it's not law. So prioritize reuse and repurposing of previously impacted land. That would be things like mines, strip mines, or even landfills. But to Tom's point, the amount of investment to get the power from there to where it needs to go, it does cause an issue for the company to make money, right? Agricultural preservation and sustainable forest management. We will talk about the ag preservation part as we go through this. The big one here is respecting local decision making on the setting of projects. So at this point, the state really hasn't, there is no legislation on this. So it's being left to the 2,600 townships who may or may not have an ordinance of any nature or any zoning, depending on that particular, that township, right? So they are leaving it at the local level at this point for the most part. Again, this is one of those slides where you can read this later. Okay, the guidance resources from the different agencies. PDA is saying, you know, maybe we shouldn't have it on class 1 through 4 soils. DCNR saying we shouldn't chop down a tree. DEP saying, well, let's look at this from a practical standpoint and see how this could benefit or at least not negate against the local population. So that's where we've come in. We worked with DEP to come up with a municipal officials guide to grid scale solar development of Pennsylvania. It's a nice 80-page read. I would suggest reading it in chunks because you will fall asleep. We're also working on a solar on schools toolkit with DEP that will be released soon on some of the incentives for schools to put solar on their roofs to offset their power. There are some proposed bills in the Senate and the House. Probably the biggest one here would be the Senate Bill 230 and the House Bill 1467. And what that would do is increase what we call the solar carve out. So right here, this 25%. Right now in Pennsylvania, according to the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standards Act, only 25% of electricity in Pennsylvania needs to be generated by solar. If these House bills and Senate bills go through, that no doubt will be increased to some degree. We don't know what that'll look like, but we're seeing anywhere between 10 and 14%. So think about that, going from 0.5% requirement to a 14%. That is a huge uptick and will require a huge amount of infrastructure to be built in order to satisfy the requirement. There's also a House bill we saw the other day came out to require Pennsylvania to go completely renewable by 2050. We don't see that getting out of committee. But so what are the what has been the response of Penn State in relation to large scale solar? And I believe that is Tom's according to our sheet.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, some of the things that we've done, again, we're getting most of the requests from farms to see how this impacts them. But we have worked with all these departments, local state governments. We have a webinar series pretty much monthly on this. So if you're looking for information, come and sign up for the webinar series. Joe mentioned the solar guide for municipal officials. There's a ton of great information on there. A lot of it looked at other states and what they had previously done and give some ideas for townships. But to Joe's point, at this point, your township really has the say on, you know, where you can develop, what you can't develop. Some of them have ordinances, some have nothing. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Reasons for solar. There is enough sun in Pennsylvania. The panels efficiency, they keep getting better and better. The price of them keep coming down. So there definitely is enough sun to produce power here. Is it the perfect place? Maybe not, but they definitely are producing enough to make some of these projects economically viable. You do need, again, there's a large amount of generation infrastructure currently here, as long as you're utilizing what's existing. But if you try to build this out, that's where the expense is enormous to add additional infrastructure on this. Joe touched on the policy part of this. Alternative Energy Portfolio Standards is a few years back. I think that was under Rendell administration. They started that. So that keeps ramping up in requirements there. Then you have declining costs through the Inflation Reduction Act. And that would be a completely separate 2-hour seminar on that. So we're not going to touch on that. Similar to Marcellus Shell, we did this. We had a lot of new income coming in for landowners and farmers, and there was uncertainty there. So we've tried to clear as much of this up for them as we can. Solar has a much larger physical footprint than a Marcellus well. You're looking at maybe less than an acre for, if you've ever been on a site of one of these, they're big, but they're nothing compared to 500 acres used up for solar. So this is a much smaller footprint on something like that. And again, Inflation Reduction Act really is pushing all this forward. This just shows some of the development here through the middle of the state from 2023 to 2030 on investment. I can't see my slide here. What's it up? Even said. Oh, okay. Okay. We're jumping already. Okay, I missed the transmission here. Okay, well, I'll hand it over to Joe.
That was definitely the transition. So I should, a little disclaimer here. We should have said this at the beginning. Penn State Extension isn't pro solar. We aren't against solar. We aren't pro gas. We aren't against gas. We aren't pro coal. We're not against coal. We're just presenting the facts as they stand. So the next, I have like 20 slides I got to roll through here. I'm doing good on time, so this will be great. Oh boy, 10 minutes. Okay, so what the slide is this has to do with the Inflation Reduction Act. So why the sudden interest in renewable energy across the country? So two things. There's an investment. Most developers will use the investment tax credit. There's also production tax credit, but that's more for windmills. But the investment tax credit, initially there's a 30% tax credit that developers would get. Now, if they satisfy certain requirements, they can get up to a 70% tax credit on these projects. That includes, has to be components have to be a certain amount American made. There have to be located in a certain area. And the big kicker, not kicker, but the big thing for Pennsylvania is this map here on the right. That's a map of Pennsylvania, but everything that has a color in it is eligible for the additional 10% tax credit, because those are considered energy communities, meaning either there was a coal plant there that maybe shut down in the last 2 decades, or there was a coal plant in an adjacent township and there's unemployment issues, or there's a certain pollutionary factor. There's 20. That's right. So you'll see that 65% of Pennsylvania is eligible for that additional 10% tax credit. So that's why Pennsylvania is of interest. Plus the pending legislation that could increase that solar carve out. Where's this all regulated through? It really isn't. So it's unregulated in many senses. PJM is the big interconnection network for this side of the country, largest in the country in the sense of population served. This is its service area, right? So if you're going to hook in your solar array, your development into the transmission lines, you have to go through PJM. All this pink on these slides are each of these represents a quarter. And all the pink on the slides is interconnection requests just for solar alone. Okay, so you look at the one on the left, the green in the pink is renewable energy. You get down into some of these darker colors, that's your coal and natural gas. You'll notice that there's really no interconnection requests for those, right? But the system was only built for the coal and natural gas to come in the dozens, not thousands of requests at one time over a period of a few years. So they have a huge backlog. So the Federal Energy Commission stepped in and said, hey, you have to restructure. We have to figure out how to make this more, not convenient, but we have to get people through the queue, through the process. So they are in the process of restructuring, and where they're at right now means all projects have essentially been delayed until they can study them properly to determine whether or not they can go on the network or not, and whether or not you can even get the power from it. So when we talk windmills, a lot of these windmills you'll see spinning, they're just going right to the ground because they have nowhere to put it in many respects, but they're getting that production tax credit. So where they're at right now, at the very top, this July 10th, they're in the 60-day readiness requirement. They should be done by now to determine who's going to get cut off the list and who stays on the list. The information has not been updated. I was in there yesterday for hours. Nothing's been updated yet, but this is the information we have. So what should happen is they should kick out a bunch of what we're calling the Q squatters that maybe we're just trying to figure out where they could put a project, but messing up the queue behind them, right? So what they're going to end up doing is they're going to start charging larger tariffs and have better deadlines to make sure that these projects are actually moving forward, as opposed to clogging the system up, if you will. When it comes to a solar project right here in Pennsylvania, we give it, when we're being nice, we say a 15 to 20% chance of actually coming to fruition. So you have hundreds and hundreds that get put in the queue, and we don't even have a dozen on the ground at this point, right? So the chances, you know, for the naysayers, the world's not going to fall in. You're not going to see thousands upon thousands of solar in your backyard in the next decade. For the people that are supporting, they have to really adjust your expectations, because it's a lot of investment, a lot of infrastructure that needs to be created in order for this to happen. This is from DEP. This is a look at the PJM queue. These are all the projects in the state. Grab that water. All the projects in the state that are in the queue, and they're in the hundreds. You can see here in Indiana, there's 7. There's actually 10. By the time I'm done with this today, I'll get it down to 3 or 4, but that actually have a viable chance of ever being developed. But you can see that, and I think it says 400 megawatts. It's probably more like just under 200 megawatts here in Indiana County, but that's across the state as of last month in PJM. The average size of these projects, the larger ones, are these 15 to 20 megawatts. So you can see there's 178 of those projects in there. That's going to be your average size project, if you will, and that will take 90 to probably 150 acres. What we are going to get into is these smaller than 5 megawatt projects, what we're calling net metering. How am I doing here? 3 minutes. Oh boy. All right. So large net metering here in Pennsylvania. There was a court case called the Heinrich case, and it allowed large net metering in Pennsylvania up to 3 megawatts without a load, meaning you could have 3 megawatts of solar out in the field and not a single light bulb attached to it, right? So what we're seeing is these are smaller projects. They're easier to get through your local townships, if you will, and they bypass PJM. So instead of these 20 megawatt ones, we're seeing smaller, dozens of acres instead of hundreds of acres projects coming on, and they are approved by the PUC, unless you're in an electric co-op, which we won't get into that. But you can see on the charts here, this last number is the big one. Ever since this came to fruition, there's been, for these large net metering projects, 230 megawatts, so 230,000 kilowatts have been requested. 193 megawatts or 192,000 kilowatts were just those merchant requests. So that's your out in the field with no light bulb attached, right? And they estimate those ventures will get about, I think, profit about $500,000 a year is where they're putting that at, depending on the initial investment. And they can break them up. So you can have a 3 megawatt next to a 3 megawatt on 2 different meters. So essentially you could throw 5 of these in a row, just on 5 different meters, 5 different projects, 5 different names, 5 different LLCs, you know, that whole get. So what does that look for land development? Was I turning that over to you at this point, or is it me still?
I got like 30 seconds.
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, I might have to yield like 2 minutes, Molly, on this. We're just going to go through a couple of the things. I think this is going to cover some of the questions that we receive, general questions that we've received. Actually, I think this still may be part of Joe's, but this is really showing when they come in to do a project, it's usually not a single contiguous area that's covered with panels. You'll see this is a project, but it's a big distance apart. So they're getting a large amount of generation, but it's spread out into areas of that may be already clear. There's already an opening there or a field. So you're probably not going to drive by and see 1,000 solid acres of development. It'll probably be broken up like this. And this is an actual multi-phase project that was submitted by Lightsource BP here in the Commonwealth. So that's just an example of how these projects kind of come to fruition. I think we kind of touched on this already. Getting the project to shovel ready, Joe was talking about land acquisition and transmission costs. They do their homework because it's a very expensive project. So it's pretty much they're going to call you, not call them. They know they've done their homework, looking at the land, the quality of the land, what they can get as far as accessibility to transmission. So that's kind of a snapshot there. They're going to look for things like the slope. How far are you from? We talked about this a bunch, but you're going to be within 3 miles of a high voltage transmission line or a substation that can support that. That's a big deal. So if you're too far out of that, you're not going to be in the running for a large scale project. Land preservation. The Department of Ag has pushed this class 1 through 4 soils. They've publicly stated that they would like to protect 1 through 4. That's a lot of the state of Pennsylvania. We have a lot of class 3, 4 soils here in Indiana County. But that is something there. We're going to touch on agrivoltaics real quick, and I mean real quick because we're going to fly through it. Oh, you're on low density rural? Okay.
Yeah, I 100% ditched you, by the way, on that. Sorry about that. So yeah, the class 1 through 4, we get an internal debate between ourselves with our agronomists. Are we looking at class 1 through 4? Are we looking for prime or non-prime, right? Because sometimes you look on the USDA maps and we'll say, well, this is class 1 soil because it's open, it's flat, but it was a strip mine. You're not growing anything on that, right? So is that really a class 1? Probably not. So anyways, when we get to the agricultural issue, and this is an internal debate for the naysayers and those that are supportive of solar. And the big one comes, well, it's going to take all of our farmland. Okay. What is the biggest off-taker of farmland in the Commonwealth, in the country? It's not solar. It's low density, residential, urban, and highly developed areas. So this is Murraysville. This is where I live. Okay. Manordale Farms, Westmoreland Farms. You can see down in the pictures below. You can actually see the old dairy barns in the pictures by the townhouses. All right. Or the warehouses. There is not a single solar array to be seen within 20 miles of my house. Right. So, we do often hear, well, this is going to ruin farming. According to the American Farmland Trust, here in Pennsylvania, by 2040, over 500,000 more acres will come under development from urban or residential development. They're estimating that 12,000 acres will come under solar. I think that's low. I think it's going to be much higher than that. It's going to be in the tens of thousands, but it won't be in the hundreds of thousands. When we look at farms that have been lost across Pennsylvania in 2012 to 2017, there were over 6,000 farms lost in Pennsylvania, 500,000 acres. This much was lost to solar arrays. So what's the real factor behind these farms that are going away? In many respects, it's not going to be solar. Solar might actually help them survive, much like the Marcellus Shale industry did when you had a farmer get a well pad and they were able to assist with their income and keep that farm in the family as it moves forward. So a land use comparison, there are almost 29 million acres here in Pennsylvania. 7.3 million of those are farm acres. Ag preservation, this is actually about 6 months old. That farmland ag preservation, that circle right there, like up to 625,000 acres. But that yellow 8,000 acres up there at the top, that's what they're projecting we would need for 10% electricity produced by solar in Pennsylvania. That 8,000 acres. So you can actually see there's more acreage covered by golf courses. All right. So siting and Zoller consideration. Now this is when I was supposed to give it to you. So we actually have 10 minutes.
I'm sorry. I thought we were done for, so we have to. Okay, we're good. We're good. Okay. I think Joe we were touching on this a little bit with ordinances, and 85%, this big takeaway on this slide, 85% of them really have nothing in place. The townships have no ordinances. So that's something that clearly they're going to want to get hashed out sooner than later. But that's something we work in conjunction with Penn State's Ag Law School on some of these things. So we've talked about some upcoming events on this to kind of give them some guidance on maybe what they could look for. But 85% of them have nothing currently around this. It talks about controls needed. Most of the zoning was enacted at municipal level. We've talked about that. The townships kind of control it. You're going to look at use versus dimensional, allowing someone where zoning exists, you can zone this out or zone it in. You've seen that with in other industries that they've wanted to kind of block out through zoning. Special use cases come into effect here. But we'll talk about some of the requirements for zoning, what they have to be kind of far away from, if they're more stringent, if they're forward facing, on how these arrays are sort of built. We'll kind of look at that. And we also have this on the rate presentation. We also have that bar at the top. Sorry about that. So one of the things that people want to do to kind of hide these panels, and some of these are put into place at the township level, is to maybe how you use plants, 7 to 8 feet away. You can have some raised barriers to kind of hide them. This is an example. This hasn't grown out yet, but in a few years, you won't really be able to see that solar array. So some of that's in the requirement for zoning. Pollinator friendly plants, you can do something with that land in between the panels. It's beneficial. We've talked with a lot of folks. Actually, we're going to tour Earned Seed in Meadville on Monday. So they're kind of pushing some of this pollinator friendly stuff. It's kind of a neat way to combine the two with some agri-solar ideas. You get some folks talking about glare. Are you going to be driving along and you get blinded and you flip your car and you have a big wreck? Well, probably not, because the panels really are there to absorb. They want to absorb light. They don't want to reflect it back at you. So that comes up. That was a common question, but they do these glare analysis on it, and that kind of shows you some of the scale compared to like a windshield. Even glare would be much higher, the sun off the windshield. So you don't really have to worry about getting blinded by solar panels. I think that comes from some of the massive arrays out in the desert. So they do use gigantic mirrors to take that and kind of actually shine it back into the panels. I think that's what scares people about it, but the arrays here in the state, they're not going to be blinding as you drive by. Noise. There is a little bit of noise from some of the equipment on site, but once you're probably 15, 20 feet away, you're not going to hear too much. It's very low output. They do require some lighting for security. So that might be a consideration, to face it downwards, downcasting the lighting. But noise and lighting, once it's installed, really isn't a big concern. But that question has come up quite a bit when we've done some of the public forums on this. Traffic impact should be minimal, other than the construction phase. They have to, bring in the panels and set up some of the fencing. But once that's in effect, it should be, like any other development. You just keep cruising on by once it's put in place. What could you see here on solar arrays with battery storage? We get questions on fire risk. On the panels themselves really aren't going to be a major fire risk. However, when you start getting into lithium batteries, yes, that could be a fire risk. So there'll be some things in place to maybe make sure there's some kind of fire safety plan and something available on site if there's battery storage. Some of the new stuff does propose a lot of battery storage, but we don't have a ton of it currently in the state. Anything affecting wildlife, obviously they try to fence this in, but birds and things get in there. So they're required to do a bunch of impact studies before they go ahead and build. So they'll go all through whatever is habitat threatened wildlife, or if it's a wetland area, that all has to be discussed before this project gets approved. So that's a pretty common question on that. And then can you farm in the panels? The answer is yes, you can. Something called agrivoltaics. I know Cornell University is doing a lot of work on this. We're doing some work on it as well. But I will say this: if you get offered a lease, let's say you get offered a lease around $1,500 an acre per year for a normal installation, if you would prefer an installation like you see here, where those panels are raised up, that's probably maybe 3-4 feet. You could go 10-15 feet. Then you better expect to see that payment go from $1,200, $1,500 to like $100, because this is an enormous increase in the cost to raise these panels up. You can do it though, and there are companies willing to do it. It's just whether the landowner is willing to take a gigantic hit in their payment to do that. But that would allow you to grow any kind of plants. Some of them we've seen wide enough to put even tractors through them. They've had cattle underneath them. There are different ways you can do this, but it does increase the expense of all this. And I'm going to hand it off for the Indiana County part from Joe.
All right. I had zero faith in us getting through this in 45 minutes, by the way. So I have 4 minutes left. All right, so what does Indiana County look like? That previous map that I showed earlier from DEP said it looked like there's about 7 projects. There's actually 10. So based on the PGM data, so you can see there's 10 projects here, but 3 of them have been withdrawn. That doesn't mean they're completely dead, but when you look at okay, well, first off, they decided to throw a wrinkle in on me. In most counties, they just do solar and storage together. For some reason, Indiana County, nothing to do with Indiana County, it was PGM, they grouped them separately. So you have solar, and then you have a separate section for storage. But I assure you, these 3 projects are part of the 3 projects I'm going to talk about here. So what you do is you got to look at the dates. These dates are furthest going back is 2019, which means these projects are all relatively new. When you look at some other counties, they're 2010, 2011. And if they were withdrawn that long ago, they are definitely cemented in the ground, never coming back, right? But these projects that were withdrawn 3 or 4 years ago, so they're probably not going to happen. So what you have to do next is look at the agreements. And most of these projects are not out of the feasibility stage. There is one project, the Lucerne project, that is in the facilities phase. What the projects want to get at to know that they're actually going to probably happen, as you can't see here, is this phase, the interconnection agreement. That means the developer is willing and has agreed to pay for the upgrades in the millions, tens of millions at some points for that project. That project is moving. The rest of these are just sitting. Okay, so what do we look like here in Indiana County? This is Indiana County. I said there was initially 7. I'm looking at actually probably 4. The Glory, Glen Campbell, these are named after the substation. So the Glory, Glen Campbell, and the Garmin Greenwich, they're what we're calling Q squatting, likely, in which they're trying to determine where the cheaper outlet will be to put into the substation. Now our intel tells us that project has actually been killed recently from what we're hearing. The Seaward Glory, if that actually went in, that would kill the Glory project up above, because that's a 100 megawatt project, I think. But the one that looks like it most likely will happen, has a chance of happening, is Lucerne outside of Homer City, which, as you all know, the city, it has the capacity at this point due to the closing of the plant there. And there is a sweet spot over between Schlachta and Keystone. My neighbor actually owns 200 acres up there below the Keystone Lake. And it's a key spot because there's 3 substations there with 345 kilovolt and 500 kilovolt lines running through there. So these projects that are on that left side of the map, only one of those projects is in Indiana. The other 2 are across the border in Armstrong. So that's what it looks like at the moment for Indiana. We also have this net metering issue, which unless they're in a rural co-op, this wouldn't show up. But what I'm seeing here in Indiana is it's not an issue yet, right? There's PUC has 91 projects that are being net metered. They're all around 10, 12, kilovolt, the size of a house, the size of a rooftop, right? And then the last thing, the solar energy industry has a data set for large industries that might be putting solar on their roofs or on their yards, essentially their acres behind their places. And you'll see there's nothing even located on the map at this point. So that's where we are in Indiana at this juncture. And we have successfully led. No time for questions.
We'll be around.
Yeah, we'll be around.